The alarm screamed before the alarms even started. I was thrown against my harness so hard that the straps cut into my shoulders, and through the cracked viewport I watched the escort ship beside mine burst into a cloud of burning metal. We were not supposed to be in a fight. This was a peacekeeping run, a quiet trip to hand over supplies to a neutral outpost near the edge of Vale Dominion space. Somebody had lied about that. My name is Ethan Cole, and I was the only human on a ship full of strangers when it happened. The Dominion cruiser that hit us did not look like it wanted to talk. It came out of nowhere, weapons already firing, and within 4 minutes, my dropship was a spinning wreck, falling toward a planet I did not know the name of. I remember shouting into a dead radio. I remember the heat. I remember waking up in restraints, my ears ringing, surrounded by tall armored figures with pale gray skin and eyes like polished stone. They did not kill me. That surprised me more than the crash did. Instead, they marched me through corridors that curved like the inside of a shell, past guards who looked at me the way you might look at an insect that wandered into your house. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody explained anything. I kept waiting for someone to put a weapon to my head, but instead, they brought me to a set of doors taller than any building I had stood in front of on Earth, and pushed them open. The throne room was silent, except for my own breathing. Every surface was black stone polished so smooth it looked wet, and thin blue light ran along the walls like veins. At the far end, on a throne carved from a single piece of dark crystal, sat a woman unlike anyone I had ever seen. Her skin held a faint silver shine, her hair was the color of storm clouds, and her eyes, when they finally settled on me, felt older than they should have for someone who looked barely older than me. Nobody told me her name. I did not need to be told. Every guard in that room straightened when she moved even slightly. This was the Queen. I stood there in torn fatigues, blood dried on the side of my face, waiting for a sentence. Executions, prisons, experiments. I had heard stories about all of it from other soldiers who dealt with unfamiliar species. My mind ran through every possible outcome except the one that actually happened. She stepped down from the throne. Guards on both sides tensed, but she raised one hand slightly, and they froze in place like statues. She walked toward me slowly, her long coat trailing over the stone floor without a sound, until she was close enough that I could see my own reflection in her eyes. "You crashed on the border of my territory," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the room anyway. "That should have ended with your death an hour ago." "Then why hasn't it?" I said. I do not know where I found the nerve to speak first, but silence felt worse than whatever she might do to me for talking. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Because of a report I received this morning about a human soldier who survived being shot down and still tried to protect 2 wounded crewmen from his own ship before he was captured." She tilted her head. "Humans are strange. You had every reason to run. You didn't." I said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. She circled me once, studying me the way you would study a puzzle piece that did not belong to the set in front of you. Then she leaned in, close enough that only I could hear her, and the words she said next changed the entire direction of my life. "My sister has been asking to see the human world for years," she whispered. "She has watched more of your history than anyone I know. And she has chosen you." I blinked. "Chosen me for what?" "Marriage," the Queen said, straightening again, her voice returning to its normal volume, as if she had just announced something as simple as the weather. "My sister wishes to marry you." For a moment I thought I had misheard her through the ringing in my ears. I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that echoed too loudly in that huge, silent room. Nobody else laughed. The guards did not move. The Queen did not blink. "You're serious," I said. "I do not joke inside my own throne room," she said. I looked around at the armored guards, at the crystal throne, at the strange blue light running along black stone walls, and I tried to find the part of this that made sense. I could not find it. "I don't even know her name," I said. "I don't know your name. I was flying supply crates an hour ago." "Her name is Isvel," the Queen said, "and mine is Ale Sarah. You may use both, since apparently your species finds titles uncomfortable." I almost laughed again, but something in her tone stopped me. Underneath the calm, there was something else. Not cruelty, something closer to caution, or maybe exhaustion, like she was carrying a weight she had been holding for a very long time and had finally decided to put part of it down in front of a stranger. "Where is she?" I asked. "Your sister. Why isn't she here asking me herself?" Something shifted in the Queen's expression, quick enough that I almost missed it. "She lives apart from the rest of the Dominion," she said, "on a world called Thren. She has lived there for a very long time, away from our people, away from visitors, away from almost everyone." "Why?" I asked. "That is not a question I will answer today," the Queen said, and the finality in her voice told me pushing further would not go well for me. I stood there trying to process what was happening. Less than 2 hours earlier, I had been checking supply manifests with 2 crewmates who were now either dead or captured somewhere in this same building. Now an alien queen was telling me her sister, someone I had never met, wanted to marry me, based apparently on nothing but old broadcasts and a report about how I acted during a crash. "And if I say no," I said carefully. The Queen studied me for a long moment. "Then you will be treated as any other prisoner of war," she said. "There will be no punishment beyond that. I am not threatening you, soldier. I am simply telling you what happens if you refuse." That was almost worse than a threat, because it meant she was being honest. This was a real choice, and both paths were frightening in different ways. One meant walking into something I could not begin to understand. The other meant sitting in a cell on an alien world while a war I barely understood decided whether Earth lived or died in the eyes of galactic powers far stronger than us. I thought about my crewmates. I thought about Earth, still new to all of this, still trying to prove to a galaxy full of ancient empires that humanity deserved a seat at any table at all. I thought about how easily an alliance with the Dominion, or the lack of one, could decide whether my planet survived the next decade. "Why me?" I asked. "Out of every human who has ever been recorded, why would she choose someone she has never actually met?" The Queen's eyes softened just slightly, and for a moment she looked less like a monarch and more like a sister worried about someone she loved. "Because you are the only human who has ever looked directly into a Dominion recording device and smiled instead of showing fear," she said. "She has watched that clip more times than I can count. She says it is the only time she has seen a stranger look at our people the way she wishes our own people looked at her." There was something underneath those words. Something about the way she said our own people looked at her that told me there was more to this story than a lonely woman falling for a stranger's smile on a screen. But I did not know that yet. All I knew was that I was standing in a throne room on an alien world, blood dried on my face, being asked to decide the rest of my life in front of an audience of silent guards. "If I agree," I said slowly, "what happens next?" "You will be transported to Thren," the Queen said. "You will meet my sister. You will decide, once you know her, whether you still wish to go through with this. Nothing will be forced on you once you arrive. I give you my word on that. And if she changes her mind—" "She won't," the Queen said, with a certainty that made me wonder exactly how well she knew her sister, and how much she was not telling me. I looked past her, toward the tall doors at the far end of the room, thinking about every version of my future that could come from the next few words out of my mouth. I thought about home, and how far away it suddenly felt. I thought about the crewmates I might never see again either way. And I thought, strangely, about that clip the Queen mentioned, a moment I barely remembered, a camera pointed at me during some routine diplomatic recording months ago, a moment I had not thought twice about since. Somewhere out there, on a hidden world called Thren, someone had watched that same moment over and over, and decided it meant something. "All right," I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected. "I'll go." The Queen studied me one last time, as if checking whether I truly meant it, and then nodded once. "Then let us not waste time," she said. "My sister has waited long enough." As the guards moved to escort me from the throne room, I caught one last look at the Queen's face, and for just a second, before the mask of royal calm returned, I saw something that looked almost like relief. Whatever waited for me on Thren, it was clear this decision mattered to her far more than a simple political arrangement should have. I did not know it yet, but I had just agreed to walk into the middle of a secret the Dominion had buried for 300 years, and the woman waiting for me on that isolated world was about to become the reason everything I thought I understood about this war, this alliance, and this galaxy was wrong. The transport ship that carried me away from the Dominion capital had no windows, which I later learned was not an accident. Nobody outside a very small circle was allowed to see the route to Thren, and I was not important enough yet to be trusted with that kind of knowledge. I sat in a narrow seat across from two silent guards for what felt like 6 hours, watching a small light on the ceiling blink at steady intervals, trying to convince myself I had made the right choice. Nobody spoke to me during the flight. When the ship finally slowed and I felt the pull of gravity change under my boots, one of the guards stood and opened a side hatch without a word. Warm air rushed in, carrying a smell I did not expect, something like rain on stone, mixed with a faint sweetness I could not place. I stepped out onto a landing platform surrounded by tall silver trees, their leaves shifting slightly even though I felt no wind. Thren did not look like a prison. That was the first thing that confused me. I had built up an image in my head during the flight, something cold and gray, a place built to punish. Instead, I found soft green hills rolling toward distant mountains, a sky painted in shades of orange and violet that Earth skies never managed, and a quiet so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. A woman stood waiting near the edge of the platform, and the moment I saw her, I understood why the Queen had spoken about her the way she had. She did not look like royalty in the way I expected. No crown, no elaborate robe, just simple dark clothing that looked practical rather than ceremonial. Her hair was lighter than her sister's, closer to pale gold, and her eyes held the same silver shine, but with something warmer behind them. Something curious instead of guarded. She was watching me the way someone studies a person they have thought about for a very long time and finally get to see in person. "You're smaller than I expected," she said, and then immediately looked embarrassed by her own words, which somehow made her seem more real to me than anything else that had happened that day. "That is not what I meant to say first. I apologize." I almost laughed, mostly from nerves. "It's fine," I said. "I get that a lot from people who only know me from photographs." "I know you from more than photographs," she said, stepping closer. "I know you from 312 hours of recorded footage, most of it stolen from broadcasts your people never meant for anyone outside your solar system to see." That stopped me. 300 hours, I repeated. "I have had a great deal of time," she said quietly, and there was something underneath those words that I did not fully understand yet, a weight she carried the same way her sister did, but heavier, older, more tired. "I'm Ethan," I said, since nobody had actually introduced me properly since I landed. "I know," she said, and this time she did smile, small and a little shy. "I am Isvel." We walked together along a stone path that wound down from the landing platform toward a cluster of low buildings nestled between the hills. She moved slowly, like someone who had all the time in the world and had learned to appreciate every second of it, which felt strange for someone who had apparently spent years locked away from her own people. "Can I ask you something?" I said, as we walked. "You can ask me anything," she said. "I would rather you ask than wonder in silence. Silence is something I have had enough of." "Why are you here?" I asked. "On this world, alone. Your sister wouldn't tell me." Isvel's steps slowed slightly. For a moment, I thought she might avoid the question the same way the Queen had, but instead, she stopped walking entirely and turned to face me, her expression carefully controlled. I was born with something inside me that our people fear, she said. An ability that runs deeper than anything in our science. Something closer to what your old stories might call a gift, though my people have never used that word for it. When I was young, before I understood what it meant, I frightened people without meaning to. Objects moved when I was upset. Thoughts that were not mine appeared in my mind, thoughts belonging to people standing near me. My parents did not know what to do with a child who could do such things. I stood there, listening, trying not to react in a way that might make her stop talking. This felt like the first real answer anyone had given me since the crash. The Dominion has old laws about abilities like mine, she continued. Laws written centuries ago, after events I have only read about in fragments, records that were mostly destroyed or sealed. All I know is that something happened long before I was born, something involving someone with abilities like mine, and it frightened our leaders badly enough that they decided anyone born with this gift should be removed from society before they could grow into it. Removed, I said carefully. You mean sent away, like this. Some were sent away, she said. Others were not so fortunate. She did not explain further, and I did not push, because the look on her face told me that particular door was not ready to be opened yet. So you've been here, I said. Alone. For how long? Since I was 12 years old, she said. I am considerably older than that now, though our years may not match yours exactly. Long enough that I stopped counting after the first century. I felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with fear of this strange new world and everything to do with the picture forming in my mind, a child taken from her family and left on an empty planet because the people around her did not understand what she was. Your sister lets you live like this, I said. She's the queen. Couldn't she change the law? She was not queen when I was sent here, Isvel said. Our mother was. And by the time Aelsara took the throne, changing the law would have meant admitting publicly that our family carries this trait, which would put both of us at far greater risk than isolation ever has. She protects me the only way she believes she safely can. She visits when she is able. She sends anything I ask for, but she has never been able to bring me home. We started walking again, slower this time, and I found myself watching her more closely, noticing the way she paid attention to small things, the shape of a leaf, the sound of some distant creature calling out across the hills, like someone determined not to waste a single detail of the world around her, even a world she had been trapped inside for most of her life. So why me? I asked finally. Out of everyone you could have watched in 300 hours of footage, why choose a human soldier you had never met? She considered the question for a long moment before answering. Because you never looked afraid, she said. I have watched recordings of Dominion citizens meeting people with abilities like mine, and even when they try to hide it, there is always something in their eyes, a flicker of fear they cannot fully control. I watched hours of your people meeting things they did not understand, alien technology, alien customs, alien dangers, and again I saw curiosity instead of fear. I began to wonder what it might feel like to be looked at that way. Not as something dangerous to be managed, but as something new to be understood. Her honesty caught me off guard. There was no manipulation in it, no performance, just a woman who had spent centuries alone, explaining, plainly, why she had reached across an entire galaxy toward a stranger. That's a lot of pressure to put on one smile in a video clip, I said, trying to keep my tone light, though my chest still felt tight. Perhaps, she said, and for the first time there was real amusement in her voice. But I have had a great deal of time to think about it, Ethan Cole. More time than most people are given to consider anything. We reached the edge of the small settlement, a handful of buildings made from pale stone, connected by covered walkways, with gardens growing between them that looked tended with real care. It was quiet in a way that felt lonely rather than peaceful once you knew the reason behind it, and I found myself looking at Isvel differently, not as a strange alien noble who had summoned me across the galaxy on a whim, but as someone who had built an entire life out of isolation and was now, cautiously, hopefully, trying to let someone else into it. "You don't have to decide anything today," she said, as if she could read the questions still spinning through my mind, though I had no way of knowing yet whether that was simply good instinct on her part or something closer to what she had described earlier. "My sister told you that already, I assume." "She did," I said. "Then take whatever time you need," Isvel said. "I have waited 300 years for someone to look at me without fear. I can wait a little longer for you to decide whether you are willing to be that person." I looked out at the hills, rolling toward the mountains, at the strange sky above us, at this quiet, beautiful, lonely world that had become someone's entire existence, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything she had done wrong. Something about the unfairness of it settled into me, and underneath the confusion and the shock of everything that had happened that day, a new feeling started to grow, something that felt a lot like anger on her behalf, and something else, quieter, that felt like the beginning of understanding why she had chosen me at all. "I don't need more time," I said, surprising myself with how certain my voice sounded. "I'm not going anywhere, Isvel, not yet." For a moment, she simply looked at me, and something in her expression shifted, careful hope breaking through years of practiced calm. "You should be careful with promises like that," she said quietly. "Not everyone here will be pleased that I have finally found someone willing to make them." I did not understand what she meant by that yet, not fully. But standing there on a hidden world under a violet sky, having agreed to marry a woman I had known for less than an hour, I was already beginning to understand that this story was far bigger than a simple diplomatic arrangement between a lonely princess and a stranded soldier. Something old and buried was waiting underneath all of this, and I had just stepped, without realizing it, directly into the middle of it. The days that followed did not feel like captivity, though I kept waiting for that feeling to arrive. Instead, they felt like something closer to discovery, both of Thren and of Isvel, and slowly, of myself in a place where nobody expected me to behave the way soldiers were trained to behave. I was given a small building of my own, near the edge of the settlement, close enough to Isvel's home that we could walk to each other easily, far enough that I had space to think when I needed it. The guards who had escorted me stayed only long enough to confirm I was settled, then returned to the transport ship and left, which surprised me until Isvel explained that almost no one was permitted to stay on Thren beyond the smallest necessary staff. Even her own protection detail lived on a separate island across the water, visiting only when summoned. "They are afraid of me," she said simply, the first morning I asked about it, as we sat outside her home, watching the sun rise in shades of deep orange over the hills. "Not the way you might think, not angry, not cruel most of the time, just careful. The way people are careful around something they were taught is dangerous before they were old enough to decide for themselves whether that was true." "Does it get to you?" I asked, "being avoided like that?" "It used to," she said. "I have had a long time to make peace with it, or perhaps I have simply grown tired of being upset by something I cannot change alone." That word, alone, kept surfacing in nearly everything she said, quiet and constant, like a heartbeat underneath the conversation. I started to notice it more the longer I stayed, the way she paused slightly before using certain words, the way she watched simple things, birds crossing the sky, water moving in a stream, with an attention that felt almost hungry, like someone determined to memorize every detail because she had learned the hard way that nothing was guaranteed to stay. I spent the first week mostly listening. She told me about her childhood before Thren, fragments of memory from a palace she had not seen in centuries, her mother's voice, her sister as a child, trailing behind her through gardens neither of them were allowed to run in. She told me about the early years on Thren, the loneliness of adjusting to a life with almost no other voices, and how she had eventually found the recordings from Earth, first by accident, then deliberately, until watching human broadcasts became the closest thing she had to company. In return, I told her about home, about basic training, about my two younger sisters back on Earth who had no idea their brother was currently sitting under a violet sky discussing marriage with an alien princess. About small, ordinary things, the smell of rain on pavement, the sound of a crowded street, the particular chaos of a human city that I had never appreciated until I was somewhere with none of it. "Tell me something no one else knows about you," she said one evening as we walked along the edge of a wide, slow river that curved around the settlement. I thought about it for a moment. When I signed up for this assignment, working alongside Dominion escorts, most people back home thought I was making a mistake, I said. They said humanity wasn't ready to be trusted around older species yet, that we'd embarrass ourselves or get someone killed. I did it anyway because I wanted to prove that wasn't true. "And now you're here," she said, a small smile touching her mouth, "agreeing to marry someone your own people have never heard of, on a world most of your species doesn't even know exists." "When you put it that way, it sounds insane," I admitted. "Most good decisions do at first," she said, "at least the ones worth remembering." It was during the second week that I first noticed something strange happen around her, something I would come to understand better as time went on. We were sitting near a small garden behind her home, and she was telling me about an old Dominion custom, something about how her people once marked important agreements by planting a tree together when a gust of wind that should not have existed, since the air had been perfectly still all morning, moved through the garden and bent the branches of every plant around us at once. I looked at her. She had gone quiet, her jaw tight, her hands pressed flat against her knees. "Are you all right?" I asked. "I am fine," she said quickly, too quickly. "Sometimes when I feel something strongly, small things happen around me. It has always been that way. I have learned to control most of it, but not always perfectly." "What were you feeling?" I asked carefully. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I was thinking about how strange it is to sit here and simply talk with someone," she said. "How ordinary this moment would be for anyone else, and how extraordinary it feels to me." Something about that answer settled into my chest and stayed there. I had spent 2 weeks slowly learning that the thing her people feared in her was not some monstrous power waiting to be unleashed, but something far more fragile, an ability tangled up so tightly with her emotions that even happiness could stir the wind. It did not feel like a threat. It felt like a wound that 300 years of isolation had never been allowed to heal properly. I started asking more questions after that, not just about her, but about the history behind the law that had put her here. She told me what little she knew, fragments passed down through careful, secretive conversations with her mother before her mother died, about an event centuries earlier involving someone with abilities similar to hers, someone whose name had been deliberately erased from most official Dominion records. "Nobody living remembers exactly what happened," she said, "only that it frightened enough powerful people that they wrote laws to prevent it from happening again, and those laws have never been questioned since, because questioning them means asking uncomfortable questions about people who still hold power today." That last part caught my attention. "What do you mean, people who still hold power today?" I asked. She hesitated, glancing toward the hills as if checking whether anyone might be listening, though we were completely alone. "There is a council of old noble families who advise my sister," she said quietly. "Several of them have sat in positions of influence for generations, long enough to have been present, or their ancestors were present, when the original law was written. I have always suspected the truth behind my isolation has less to do with genuine danger and more to do with protecting reputations that would be damaged if certain old secrets came to light." I sat with that for a moment, turning it over in my mind. Back home, I had grown up learning that the most dangerous secrets were rarely protected because they were true threats. More often, they were protected because someone powerful benefited from everyone believing they were true threats. "Have you ever tried to find out more?" I asked. The alarm on my console screamed, before I even understood. "Whatever is left of them. I am not permitted access to Dominion archives," she said. "Prisoners, even comfortable ones, do not receive research privileges. I'm not a prisoner, I said slowly, an idea forming as I spoke. At least, not exactly, I could ask. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen from her before, something between hope and caution, like she was afraid to let herself believe anyone would actually try. Veil Sara would not easily grant that kind of request, she said, even to someone she has personally chosen to bring here. Then I'll ask carefully, I said, but I'd like to know why an entire species decided a child needed to be locked away for something she couldn't control. If there's a real reason, I want to understand it, and if there isn't, I think you deserve to know that too. Over the following days, I began sending messages back to the capital, carefully worded requests routed through the small communication relay installed near my building, the only connection Thren had to the outside world. Most of my questions went unanswered. A few came back with vague, formal replies that told me nothing beyond what Isvel had already shared. But one evening, nearly 3 weeks into my stay, a response arrived that was different, short, almost hurried, from someone I did not recognize, an archivist working within the Palace Records Division. The message said very little directly. It mentioned that certain records regarding what it called the incident of 3 centuries past had been sealed under a specific noble family's authority rather than the Crown's, and that further inquiries should be directed carefully, since several council members had expressed strong displeasure at any questions being raised about that period. I read the message 3 times before showing it to Isvel. When she finished reading it herself, her hands were trembling slightly, and this time no wind moved through the garden, but I noticed the small lamp beside her flicker once, unprompted. "A noble family," she said quietly. "Not the crown. That means whatever happened 300 years ago was never truly about protecting the Dominion from something dangerous. It was about protecting one family's reputation, and every person like me, who has been sent away since, has paid the price for a secret that was never mine to carry." I watched her carefully, waiting to see how she would react to the anger clearly building underneath her calm exterior, remembering what she had told me about small things happening when her emotions grew strong. But instead of the wind rising or the ground trembling, she simply sat very still, staring at the message in her hands, and when she finally looked up at me, her eyes were steady. "I want to know the truth," she said. "All of it. Even if it changes nothing about my situation, even if the law never changes because of it, I have spent 300 years accepting a story I was told as a child, without ever being permitted to ask if that story was even real." "Then we find out together," I said. "I'm not going anywhere, remember. I already promised you that." She studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression softened into something warmer than I had seen from her yet. Not quite relief, not quite hope, but the early shape of both. "You keep proving my sister right," she said, "about why she chose to bring you here in the first place." "What do you mean?" I asked. "She told me once, long before you ever arrived, that if humanity ever sent someone worth trusting to Thren, we would know, because they would refuse to simply accept the version of the story they were given," Isvel said. "She believed your people were too stubborn, too curious, to leave a mystery unexamined, even one that was not truly theirs to solve." I thought about that for a while after she said it, about how strange it was that an alien queen I had met only once had somehow understood something about humanity that took me most of my life to fully appreciate about my own people, our refusal to simply accept impossible as a final answer, our habit of pushing at locked doors just to see what might be behind them. Over the following days, that stubbornness became something we shared. Isvel began teaching me small pieces of the abilities she carried, not to control them exactly, but to help me understand what they actually were, rather than the frightening rumors that had followed her for centuries. I learned that the wind that moved when she felt strong emotion was not random destruction waiting to happen, but something closer to an extension of her own feelings reaching outward, gentle when she was calm, unpredictable only because she had never been given the guidance or the freedom to properly understand it herself. "Nobody ever taught you how to use this," I said one afternoon, watching as she carefully lifted a small stone from the ground without touching it, her expression tight with concentration. "Nobody was willing to get close enough to try," she said, setting the stone down gently. "Thren has kept me safe from causing harm to others, I suppose, but it has also kept me from ever learning what I am truly capable of, whether for good or otherwise." "Then let's find out," I said, slowly, carefully, together. And so, alongside the search for the truth buried somewhere in sealed Dominion records, we began something else entirely, a quiet, careful process of understanding what Isvel actually was, not the monster her people feared, not the fragile prisoner 300 years of isolation had nearly convinced her she must be, but something new, something that had simply never been given the chance to exist without fear standing in the way. By the end of the 4th week, I received a second message from the same archivist, this one shorter, more urgent than the first, warning me that continued questions were drawing attention from powerful people within the capital who did not welcome them. I read it standing outside my building as the sun set over the hills of Thren, painting the sky in colors I still had not gotten used to, and felt, for the first time since arriving, something that resembled real danger settling into my chest. Whatever we were beginning to uncover, someone with real power did not want it found. The Queen arrived on Thren 11 days before the wedding, and her arrival changed the entire mood of the settlement. Where before there had only been Isvel, myself, and a handful of quiet staff tending the gardens, suddenly the small landing platform was crowded with ships, guards, and officials I had never seen before, all of them moving with the careful, tense energy of people who understood that something important was about to happen. Ailsara found me first, before she even greeted her sister, walking straight toward my building with 2 guards trailing several steps behind her, close enough to maintain protocol, but far enough to give the impression of privacy. "You have been sending messages to my archives division," she said, without any greeting at all, stopping in front of me with an expression I could not fully read. "I have," I said, deciding there was no point pretending otherwise. I wanted to understand why Isvel was really sent here. "And what have you learned?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. I told her everything, the sealed records, the noble family named as the authority behind the original ruling rather than the crown, the warnings that had followed my continued questions. As I spoke, I watched her expression shift from careful neutrality into something harder, something that looked a great deal like anger she had been holding back for a very long time. "I suspected as much for years," she said quietly, once I finished. "I was never given full access to those records either, soldier. Being queen does not grant unlimited authority, particularly over matters certain families have controlled since long before I was born. I simply never had proof strong enough to challenge them directly." "And now," I asked. "Now you have given me a thread to pull," she said. "Whether that thread leads somewhere useful before the wedding, I do not yet know, but I intend to find out." Over the following days, the settlement filled further with arrivals, some there to help prepare the ceremony, others there, I began to realize, to observe. Isvel grew quieter as the wedding approached, not from doubt about marrying me, she assured me of that more than once, but from the pressure of stepping, after 300 years of isolation, back into a world that had never stopped fearing her. "They are watching to see if I will lose control," she said one evening, as attendants moved through her home, preparing decorations for the ceremony. "Every guard here has been given instructions on what to do if something happens. I can feel it in the way they look at me." "Then we give them nothing to be afraid of," I said. "We show them exactly what I've been seeing every day for the past month. Someone patient, careful, and far more in control than they've ever given you credit for." 3 days before the ceremony, the archivist who had been sending me careful, coded messages disappeared entirely. My final message to the relay returned no response at all, not even the formal, evasive replies I had grown used to. When I told Ailsara, her expression darkened in a way that told me she understood exactly what that silence likely meant. "There is a council session scheduled the morning of the wedding," she said. "Several senior members requested it personally, which is unusual, since ceremonial matters do not typically require council approval. I believe they intend to use it as an opportunity to raise objections before the marriage can be finalized." "Can they actually stop it?" I asked. "Not directly," she said. "The final decision belongs to my sister and to me. But they can make the process difficult, publicly humiliating, or dangerous, depending on how far they are willing to go to protect whatever they are hiding." I spent the night before the ceremony, unable to sleep, running through every possible version of what the following day might bring. When morning finally came, the sky over Thren was clear and pale gold, and the settlement had been transformed overnight into something that actually resembled a place prepared for celebration. Flowers woven through the covered walkways, long tables set beneath the silver trees, soft lanterns hanging even though the daylight made them unnecessary. Isvel met me near the garden where we had spent so many of our early mornings together, dressed simply but beautifully in pale silver fabric that caught the light with every small movement. For a moment, standing there together, none of the danger surrounding us felt real at all. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. "A little," I admitted. "Not of marrying you, of whatever the council decides to do about it." "Whatever happens," she said, taking my hand, "I am glad it is you standing here with me." The council chamber, when we were called there before the ceremony could officially begin, was smaller than the throne room, but somehow felt more suffocating. Packed with older Dominion nobles seated in a tight semicircle, their expressions ranging from carefully polite to openly hostile. Aelsara stood at the center, with Isvel and me positioned beside her, and I felt every eye in that room settle on us the moment we entered. An older noble I did not recognize, his coat marked with symbols that clearly indicated significant rank, rose first. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing the Queen directly, while his eyes stayed fixed on Isvel, "this council has served the Dominion faithfully for generations, upholding laws established for the safety of our people. We cannot in good conscience allow a marriage that grants your sister greater freedom to move among Dominion citizens without addressing the very real concerns that led to her isolation in the first place." "Then address them," Aelsara said, her voice sharp. "Tell this room exactly what those concerns are, Councilman Varath. Tell everyone here the details of the incident your family has kept sealed for 3 centuries." The room went completely silent. Varath's composure cracked, just slightly, just long enough for me to see it. "Those records remain sealed for reasons of state security," he said carefully. "Or," Aelsara said, stepping forward, "they remain sealed because the incident that supposedly justified isolating an entire class of citizens for 300 years had nothing to do with genuine danger, and everything to do with protecting your family's reputation after your own ancestor caused harm your family has spent centuries blaming on an ability he did not even fully understand." Gasps moved through the chamber. I looked at Isvel, whose expression had gone completely still, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. I stepped closer, close enough that our shoulders touched, hoping the small contact might steady her the way it seemed to whenever emotions ran high. "That is a serious accusation, Your Majesty," Varath said, his voice tightening. "It is," Aelsara agreed, "which is why I intend to have it fully investigated, beginning today, with full access to every record your family has kept sealed under claims of state security. If I am wrong, the investigation will prove it, and I will apologize publicly. If I am right, your family will answer for 3 centuries of unnecessary suffering caused by people who never deserved it." Another council member, younger, quieter than Varath, rose slowly from his seat. "Your Majesty, if I may," he said carefully, "some of us have long suspected the original justification for these laws was incomplete, at best. I would welcome a full investigation, whatever it reveals." Murmurs spread through the chamber, some in support, some clearly resistant, but the unified front I had expected the council to present had visibly cracked. Vareth looked around at his fellow nobles, sensing correctly that the ground beneath him was shifting. "This is a matter that requires careful, private deliberation," he said, attempting to regain control of the room. "Not decisions made hastily in front of a human soldier and a princess whose very presence here proves the danger these laws were designed to prevent." I felt something tighten inside me at that, a mix of anger and protectiveness I had not fully expected. "With respect," I said, speaking for the first time since entering the chamber, my voice carrying further than I intended in the tense silence. "I have spent the last month living beside Isvel every single day. I have seen exactly what her abilities do when she is calm, cared for, and given space to understand herself instead of being locked away and feared. If there is real danger in this room today, Councilman, I don't think it's coming from her." The silence that followed felt different from the silence before, heavier with something that might have been reconsideration rather than simple shock. Al-Sara looked at me with an expression I had not seen from her before, something close to gratitude. "The investigation begins today," she said firmly, turning back to face the full council. "The wedding will proceed as planned, and any member of this council who wishes to obstruct either decision may explain their reasoning directly to me, in private, immediately following this session." Nobody moved to object further. Vareth sat back down slowly, his expression carefully blank, though I noticed his hands were not entirely steady. Whatever secret his family had protected for 300 years, it was clear that today marked the beginning of it finally coming apart. As we left the council chamber, Isvel's hand found mine again, and this time I felt something different in her grip, not the careful restraint I had grown used to, but something steadier, something that felt, for the first time since I had met her, genuinely unafraid. "Whatever happens with the investigation," she said quietly, as we walked back toward the garden where our ceremony still waited to begin, "today is the first time in 300 years that anyone has stood in front of that council and openly questioned them on my behalf." "It won't be the last time," I said. "I promise you that." She looked at me, and for just a moment the wind around us stirred gently, not with fear or tension this time, but with something that felt, unmistakably, like happiness finally given room to breathe. The ceremony began less than an hour after we left the council chamber, though it felt like stepping into an entirely different world compared to the tension we had just walked through. The garden had been transformed while we were gone, soft lanterns now glowing gently against the fading afternoon light, rows of Dominion officials and Thren staff standing quietly among the silver trees, watching as Isvel and I walked together toward the center of the space where Al-Sara waited to preside over the ceremony herself. I will admit, I do not remember every detail of what was said. Dominion wedding customs are layered with old language and formal phrases that even Isvel later admitted most modern couples barely understood anymore. Tradition kept alive, more out of respect than meaning. What I remember clearly is the moment Al-Sara asked Isvel, in front of everyone gathered, whether she chose this marriage freely, without pressure, without fear. "I do," Isvel said, her voice steady and clear, carrying across the garden in a way that silenced even the soft rustling of the trees. "I have chosen this every day for the past month, and I choose it again now, in front of everyone who once believed I was incapable of choosing anything safely at all." There was a pause after she said it, a ripple of reaction moving through the gathered officials, some visibly moved, others clearly uncomfortable being reminded so directly of the fear that had shaped her entire life. When Al-Sara turned the same question toward me, I found the answer came easily, without hesitation. "I do," I said, and for what it's worth, I think the fear surrounding her was never about anything she actually did. It was about what people assumed she might do, before they ever gave her the chance to prove otherwise. The ceremony concluded quietly after that. No dramatic gestures, no elaborate spectacle, just a quiet promise exchanged between two people who had somehow found each other across an impossible distance, both literal and otherwise. But the true turning point of that day did not happen during the ceremony itself. It happened afterward, as the sun finished setting and the celebration moved into the evening, when word arrived from the capital that changed everything. A runner, one of Ailsara's personal aides, arrived breathless at the edge of the celebration, moving directly toward the queen with an urgency that immediately drew attention from everyone nearby. I watched Ailsara's expression shift as she listened to whatever the aide reported, her composure cracking just slightly before she straightened again and turned toward the gathered guests. "It appears," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the quieted garden, "that Councilman Verath's family archive has just been located, along with records his family has claimed for 3 centuries did not exist." A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Isvel's hand tightened around mine. "The investigation moved faster than anticipated," Ailsara continued, "because several junior archivists, upon hearing that a formal inquiry had finally been authorized, came forward with copies of documents they had secretly preserved for years, fearing exactly this kind of concealment might one day need to be exposed. I thought immediately of the archivist who had first responded to my messages, who had gone silent days before the wedding. I wondered if this was connected, if that silence had not meant danger after all, but rather someone quietly working behind the scenes toward exactly this outcome. "What do the records say?" Isvel asked, her voice quieter than the queen's, but somehow just as clear in the silence that followed. Ailsara looked at her sister for a long moment before answering. "They say that the incident 3 centuries ago involved a young woman with abilities identical to yours," she said carefully. "A woman who was never given guidance, never given understanding, and who was eventually cornered and threatened by a group of frightened nobles, including Councilman Verath's ancestor, during a confrontation that spiraled entirely out of control. The damage caused that day was blamed entirely on her ability, when in truth, the records suggest, it began because the people confronting her attacked first, and she reacted in fear, the same way anyone might, human or otherwise. The garden had gone completely silent. Even the lanterns seemed to burn quieter. Rather than admit their own role in what happened," Ailsara continued, "the families involved wrote laws blaming the ability itself, ensuring no one would ever question their version of events, and ensuring anyone born with a similar gift afterward would be removed from society before they could ever challenge that story." Isvel stood very still beside me, and I felt the air around us shift slightly, not with anger this time, but with something heavier, something like grief, finally given permission to surface after 300 years of being denied it. "All this time," she said quietly, "I believed I was being protected from becoming something dangerous. I never imagined I was simply being hidden so an old lie could remain convenient." "I am sorry," Ailsara said, and for the first time since I had met her, the queen's composed exterior fully broke, her voice thick with an emotion she had clearly been holding back for a very long time. "I should have pushed harder, years ago, to find this truth. I let old fear convince me that protecting you meant keeping you away, rather than fighting for you to be understood." Isvel reached out and took her sister's hand, and for a moment the two of them simply stood together, 2 sisters separated for centuries by a lie neither of them had created, finally standing on the same side of the truth. "You are fighting for me now," Isvel said softly. "That matters more than the years we lost." The following weeks moved quickly, faster than I ever expected, given how slowly everything on Thren had unfolded during my first month there. With the sealed records made public, the old law requiring isolation for anyone born with abilities like Isvel's was formally challenged before the full council, and this time, without a unified front of powerful families protecting a shared secret, the resistance collapsed almost entirely. Councilman Verath was removed from his position, along with 2 others whose families had been named in the recovered documents, and a new process was established, one focused on understanding and guidance rather than isolation and fear. Isvel was asked, cautiously at first whether she would be willing to help design that new process, given that she understood better than almost anyone what guidance might have meant for her own childhood, had it ever been offered. She agreed immediately, and within a season, the first young Dominion citizen born with abilities similar to hers was brought not to an isolated world, but to a properly staffed facility near the capital, with trained guardians, and, for the first time in 3 centuries, an actual chance to grow up understood rather than feared. I watched Isvel step into that role with a kind of quiet determination that reminded me why she had chosen to reach across the galaxy toward a stranger in the first place. She had spent 300 years being told her nature was something to fear, and now, given the smallest opening, she was rebuilding an entire system meant to ensure no other child would ever have to learn that same painful lesson alone. My own role in all of this became something I had not expected when I first agreed to marry her. Word of what had happened on Thren spread slowly through Dominion space, and with it came curiosity, not just about Isvel's ability, finally being understood rather than hidden, but about humanity itself, the species that had apparently sent a soldier willing to question 3 centuries of settled law simply because something about it did not sit right with him. Aelsara mentioned it to me directly, several months after the wedding, during a visit to Thren that no longer required the same secrecy it once had. "You have done something for my people I could not do alone," she said, as we stood together, watching Isvel work with a group of new arrivals in the gardens that had once belonged entirely to her isolation. "You looked at something my entire society had accepted without question, and you simply asked why. It seems a very human thing to do. I just didn't like watching someone get punished for something that was never her fault," I said. "That is precisely the point," Aelsara said, smiling slightly. "My people have spent centuries assuming that unfamiliar things must be dangerous until proven otherwise. Your people, from what I have observed, tend to assume the opposite, that unfamiliar things deserve curiosity until proven dangerous. It is a small difference, but it changes everything about how a society treats the people living inside it." I thought about that a great deal in the months that followed, as Thren slowly transformed from an isolated prison into something closer to what it had always deserved to be, a beautiful, quiet world that people visited by choice rather than exile. Isvel and I stayed there together, though no longer alone, as more people arrived, first cautiously, then with growing confidence, curious to meet the woman whose story had reshaped an old, broken law, and the human soldier who had refused to accept isolation as a fair answer to something so simple as being born different. There were difficult days too, of course. Change rarely arrives smoothly, and there were still nobles, still ordinary citizens, who clung to old fears despite the truth being laid bare in front of them. Isvel still had moments where the weight of 300 years pressed down harder than any single conversation could fully lift, and I learned, slowly, how to sit with her through those moments, without trying to rush her back toward calm before she was ready. But there were good days too, more of them as time went on, mornings spent walking along the same river where she had first told me she had waited 300 years for someone to look at her without fear. Evenings spent watching new arrivals to Thren laugh together in gardens that had once been the loneliest place in the entire Dominion. Almost a year after the wedding, Aelsara visited Thren once more, this time bringing news that surprised even me. The Dominion Council, still reshaping itself in the aftermath of everything that had come to light, had voted to formally open diplomatic communication with Earth, citing, among other reasons, the demonstrated character of the human soldier who had married into their royal family and helped uncover a truth their own society had buried for centuries. "It seems," Aelsara said, as we stood together on the same landing platform where I had first arrived, frightened and uncertain, all those months ago, "that your people are no longer simply a curiosity to be observed from a distance. You are being taken seriously, Ethan Cole, largely because of what happened here." I looked toward the hills, toward the settlement where Isvel was waiting for me, no longer isolated, no longer alone, surrounded now by a community she had helped build out of the wreckage of an old, unjust fear. I thought about the crash that had brought me here, the whisper in a throne room that had felt at the time like the strangest offer I would ever receive, and the year that had followed, stranger and more meaningful than anything I could have imagined, standing in that wreckage, bleeding and uncertain, wondering if I would survive the day. "I didn't come here to change anything," I said finally. "I just didn't like watching someone suffer for a lie." "Perhaps," Ailsara said, "but sometimes that is exactly how the largest changes begin, not with grand plans, but with one person simply refusing to accept an unfair answer." Isvel met us halfway down the path, her smile warm and unguarded in a way it had not been the day I first arrived, and as she reached for my hand, I felt something I had not expected to find so far from home, a sense that I had not simply survived a crash landing on a hostile world, but had somehow found exactly where I was meant to be. The wind moved gently through the trees around us, calm and easy, no longer a symptom of fear held too tightly for too long, but simply the quiet sound of a world finally allowed to breathe freely, alongside the woman who had waited 300 years for someone to look at her and see nothing to be afraid of at all.